As an artist, I'm just interested in what happens when you put two things right next to each other that don't seem like they necessarily go right together. And the point at which I discovered that I would be preaching this Sunday, and that the two primary things that seemed to be in play were the story of the Transfiguration and Black History Month, I thought, well, what am I going to do with that? And that's where that sermon title came out. Now, I have to confess that at that particular moment, I was in a whole crowd of UU ministers. I don't know if that had anything to do with it.
What is UU?
Oh, Unitarian Universalist ministers. So I don't blame them at all. Actually, it was kind of an insight. I should give them credit, shouldn't I? But anyway, what is it that we find when we look at that intersection of Transfiguration and Black History Month? So let's start with the story. I've told this story more times than I deserve. So I'm just wondering, I think you know this story and I want to find out. I mean, this isn't like a test or anything, and if you have an advanced degree, don't put your hand up, You could go like this, call me, but we'll just give everyone a chance to kind of add into the story. So what happened? What is the story of the Transfiguration? First of all, who was involved? Can we name the characters in that? Jesus. That was the easy answer. Who else? James, one of the disciples. John, another disciple. Peter. All right, we've got the disciples down. I'm impressed that you get the other two. Usually the disciple story is like, Peter and a couple of other guys. All right, so we got that down. And where were they headed? Up the mountain. Well, of course, and there's the mountain right there. So they headed up the mountain. And now this story is in different gospels, so we're using the Gospel of Mark this morning. That's not important. But what was it? What was the kind of strange and wonderful and bizarre thing that happened at the top of the mountain?
Jesus was asking the Father to, let this cup pass me.
That's a little bit later in the story. Yeah, but it's the same idea. There was a lot of light. Yeah. And in the story, it describes his clothes as being a glowing white, whiter than you can kind of imagine. But at some point or another, Jesus started to kind of glow. And then what was Peter's response to this? And what else did they see? There was something else that was happening. He was transformed by light, and there was another part of this vision. What was that? I'm sorry? Thrones, yeah. So we're getting close. So a couple of other characters seemed to appear in front of their eyes alongside with Jesus. So it looked like Jesus was talking to a couple. Elijah was one. Who was the other? Moses. So it looked like Jesus was in conversation with Moses and Elijah. And then Peter's response to this, what did he want to do? He wanted to build a tent or a pavilion or something or other. I don't know, a little shack. I'm not quite sure exactly what he had in mind. But he wanted to build something, and the common interpretation of that story is that he wanted to preserve this moment, that somehow he wanted to make this moment last. And then there was a voice. And where did the voice come from? Where does the voice always come from in these stories? Yeah, up there, and who was speaking? It was God. And God said, "This is my son, my beloved son. Listen to him." And then the vision kind of evaporated, and they headed down the hill. And Jesus did what he always did. Obviously, ineffectively, he said, "Don't tell anyone about this." That was a complete failure. Yeah. So here we are. We have this story of kind of this idea of a tremendous amount of light. And even though the scripture somehow says that it was Jesus' clothes that were glowing, I mean, I think my picture of this is that Jesus was just full of light. And, I think we've seen this in other people where, we say that thing, "Oh, you're glowing. You're glowing." So I think this is not the most uncommon of experiences. It's obviously a big deal and a very special deal. But this idea that someone might be just completely infused with the Spirit of God, that they would be transfigured, that they would be transformed. Now, here's where I think I want to just stop for a minute, because, it would be fairly easy for us in this picture and it's fairly easy for us, I think, as we look at images comparing lightness and darkness, for that to have racial overtones. Years ago, I was partnered with a UU minister, Mark Bellatini, and at the time, he served as the chair of the UU hymnal committee. They were putting together a new hymnal, much like the UCC, and about the time that the UCC was doing that. And so I heard some of the stories about that process. And at one point in that process, they had a very serious discussion about whether they were going to use any hymns in the hymnal that used metaphors of light and dark, precisely because those things can get confused. Now, I don't remember actually what decision they came to out of all that, but that was kind of the first time that I was introduced to that idea, that we might need to look at those metaphors from that point of view. And I think it's valid. I don't think that they're completely conflated, I don't. But I do think that there's enough of the overlap that we want to be careful about that. So when Jesus was filled with the light, he wasn't becoming really, really white. And we have kind of made Jesus into a white person, I think. You know, the pictures that I grew up with, you know, kind of blondish, brownish hair and blue eyes, and, you know, I don't think that that could anyway be historically accurate. You know, I understand the process that any people might go through to make important figures in their belief systems to be much like themselves. But there's been kind of a process that has come mostly out of European history, where Jesus has been made more and more white over time. I mean, it's just interesting. No one knows what Jesus looks like. But we have constructions, we've seen photos. Last week I was telling the story of the guys lowering the paralytic down through the roof. And I was doing some looking online, and I came across a couple of YouTube videos of that story. One of them was an animated version, and one was kind of more of a realistic story. And it was interesting, in both cases, Jesus had an English accent. And and the Pharisees, they sounded a little bit like Chicago mobsters. You know, this Jesus, he's quack, quack, quack. You know, so it was just, you know, it's just interesting how we go about doing that. And if you look at movies that are often made that are trying to depict those times, usually it's the people in power have English accents, and the people who don't have much power have New Jersey accents. And you know, this is just, and then the other thing I thought was interesting about the one kind of the real life one was Jesus was, you know, he had kind of a longish nose, but it was quite narrow, and he had his hair, you know, he had the kind of hair, it was kind of like shoulder length, and it was kind of brown with highlights, and it was the kind of hair that, you know, you felt like it could go like this with, yeah, kind of very much like that, exactly, like that. And, you know, I don't know what Jesus' hair was like in that time, but I just thought that was interesting that that's the way they chose to depict him. And, you know, I also remember seeing in a museum, National History Museum, it was this little thing showing how tall people were through history. And, you know, in Jesus' time, people were all much shorter than we were. They were probably between 4 and 5 feet tall. So Jesus was short compared to us. Yeah, exactly. That's right. This would be a time, you know, if Jesus actually appeared, you'd want to have Rachel with you because she could look him right in the eye. But, you know, if Jesus suddenly appeared and you realized, oh, you know, and this is the point I'd like for us to just kind of realize, that many, 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 many Christians are choosing to follow a spiritual leader who is of a different race, a different ethnicity, even a different religion. He was a Jew. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew. He might have been trying to shift that practice, but that was his cultural tradition. And we won't even talk about his size, because size isn't important. Some of the shortest people are the tallest people in spirit. I know that from my own experience. So that's what I think the deal is. That's just a good thing to remember during a month like this, where we're looking at lifting up our racial diversity. And I don't know exactly why this story, the role it's supposed to play in the canon. My guess is two things. One, it was to really establish Jesus' very special nature, that there was a time, like Rachel mentioned, where his true nature was revealed fully. His disciples could see him in his fullness. This is my son, God said. And the other was in this little part of the vision where he's with Elijah and Moses, that this was the place where it was being established that he was as important as those two figures who would have been very important to the people at that time. But I think that there can be more for this story for us today. And here's what I think. I think that we should be able to assume that anyone can be transfigured. Anyone can be transformed by the Spirit of God. We can see the light and the glow of God in any person, any race, any ethnicity, any religious tradition. That is a birthright of ours in this tradition, that we can be full of that light. And as we're thinking about Black History Month, oftentimes we lift up certain important people in history, and I thought, well, if I wanted to lift something up at this point from African American culture, what would it be? And I realized that I wanted to take this opportunity to go in a slightly different direction and to lift up another more kind of wider and a different kind of group. And the image that came almost immediately to my mind was any African American woman who took any action in her life to make the lives of her children better. The sort of sacrifices that mothers and fathers did throughout history in very difficult circumstances, knowing that they probably weren't going to benefit from what they were doing, but that their children might. And that kind of sacrifice, which I think is also very much alive in our culture, is an important thing for us to remember. And I wanted to just read a little bit from a book called Brown Girl Dreaming, which is by Jacqueline Woodson. And in this book, Jacqueline is telling the story of her family through a series of poems. And the Woodsons, some of the Woodsons traced their lineage back to the children of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. But this particular story, or poem, is called, Day Work. I'm sorry, here it is. Day Work. I'd like to read this to you. There is day work for colored women. In the mornings, their dark bodies fill the crosstown buses, taking them away from Nickel Town to the other side of Greenville, where the white people live. Our grandmother tells us this as she sits a small hat with a topaz pin on her head, pulls white gloves over her soft brown hands. 2 days a week, she joins the women, taking on this second job now that there are 4 more mouths to feed. And the money she gets from part-time teaching isn't enough anymore. I'm not ashamed, she says. Cleaning is what I know. I'm not ashamed if it feeds my children. When she returns in the evening, her hands are ashen from washing other people's clothes, most often by hand. Her ankles swollen from standing all day, making beds and sweeping floors, shaking dust from curtains, picking up after other people's children, cooking. The list goes on and on. Don't any of you ever do day work, she warns us. I'm doing it now, so you don't have to. And maybe all across Nickel Town, other children are hearing this too. During this time of transfiguration and this time of lifting up the power and the culture of African Americans, may we look for the light of God in everyone we encounter.